Good evening. Hi, I am Hyungyung Kim from Gihasa. Today, hosted by the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs under the theme of Turning the COVID-19 Crisis into an Opportunity, we have experts from Korea, UK, France, and Germany to talk about the social policy responses and current issues of each country regarding COVID-19. We will go in the order of UK, France, Germany, and Korea. And then after the presentations, we'll have the Q&A session and the panel discussions. First, we have Mr. Neil Lunt, a professor at York University, Professor Christine Erhel from CNAM, Christina Hiesel, professor at the Goethe University of Frankfurt, and last but not least, Senior Research Fellow, Mr. Tae-wan Kim from Gihasa. We will first set the stage, and we'll have Mr. Shinuk Kang, the Senior Research Fellow, be the moderator, and then Professor Jung Jae-hoon of Seoul Women's University, Professor Son Dong-gi of Honam University, and Professor Young Yu-shin of University of Helsinki, and I will participate in the panel discussion. Also, as a joint research team, Dr. Michael Crowder from York University and Professor Pierre Courtieu from Paris School of Business are working together. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to the professors from all over the world, as well as those who attended the offline site. First, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Professor Neil Lunt from York University and Professor John Hudson. Can you hear us? Yes, please.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk this morning. I'm going to introduce the presentation and set the context on behalf of Professor Hudson and Dr. Crowder. This is the second paper that we've put together for Gihasa. The first was an overview and a description and what we're going to try and do here is really focus more on the policy implications, the so what, the politics of social security. Presentation's in three parts. First, I'll talk to some background. Some preliminary points to set the scene. In the UK, there are devolved administrative powers. So we have the UK, but importantly, we have 4 home nations. And when we think about the impact of the pandemic, we must remember that certain policy matters are the responsibility of the devolved administrations. So, for example, health, social services, while some fields, social security and pensions, are reserved as parliamentary UK-wide matters. Now, those are important distinctions because the countries, England, Ireland, Scotland, Northern Ireland, developed different lockdown tiers and had different levels of lockdown restrictions. In our discussion, we'll focus as much as we can on policy relating to England. It's also important to acknowledge that policy in response to COVID was developed under urgency. A series of measures unfolded, and they unfolded successively and continuously throughout the pandemic. We also would point to there being continuing uncertainties, and really we've got an evolving picture here. We can't necessarily present a very clear picture of the labour market implications. We're in a phase of recovery at the moment. Recovery appears to be underway. There's a huge number of vacancies, but furlough, a major government support measure, has just ended, and that will serve to complicate the picture much further. Only this week, the government announced £500 million of further job creation measures, targeting particularly those aged over 50 years of age. And so the picture is continuously evolving. Further COVID restrictions could add to that complexity. And of course, the implications for the UK of Brexit and the fallout of Brexit, the move away from the European Union, are still not clear. It is fair to say that the pandemic has shaken the 5 pillars of the welfare state. It has asked questions of the National Health Service in terms of the NHS response, its preparedness, the implications of focusing on tackling the pandemic in relation to other operations and interventions that have been delayed, and it's shown a real weakness in the UK social care system. Education has been impacted, schooling has been lost. Of course, the impacts have not been equal across the UK in terms of the schooling that was delivered online to students. Been significant disruption in higher education, and the mental health and well-being fallout is still being counted. Significant implications for housing in terms of how we immediately responded to the problem of those who were rough sleepers when the pandemic hit, and how we secured the tenancy rights of individuals and families during the pandemic. But there's been further housing complications as we've moved out of the pandemic, particularly in terms of rapid house price rises. But the real focus today will be on employment and social security, thinking about how the pandemic has impacted on different sectors, the implications for home working, self-employment and business support. And really we're going to try and frame our discussion in terms of the implications for social security narratives and debates as we move forward. To trace a timeline of COVID in the UK and the measures, we can see that in March 2020, lockdown was first announced by the Prime Minister, and deaths soon rose to 1,000 a day. At this point, there were major government responses, both in terms of health response, but also in terms of social security and employment support. The Chancellor of the Exchequer promised to do whatever it takes to support families and communities during the pandemic. There were significant expansion of government intervention in terms of what we call the furlough scheme, and a benefit uplift to those in receipt of social security. We moved into the second lockdown in autumn 2020, and then a third in early 2021. And as the vaccine rollout took hold, restrictions were gradually loosened until we reach the end of July 2021, when COVID restrictions are no longer in place. And as we move to autumn 2021, the vast majority of employment support measures have been removed. In thinking about the impacts on the population in terms of labour market and benefit recipients, we can perhaps divide those into 4 groups. First, there are those that are employees that are temporarily laid off, they receive support under what we call the furlough scheme. That furlough scheme supported at its peak nearly 9 million jobs. That number fell and then rose again as further lockdown measures were introduced. Furlough scheme operates through the national tax collection system. It provides grants to employers to a ceiling, initially 80%, then reduced to 60%. And this has been instrumental in preventing large rises in unemployment. Second major pillar of support was to self-employed that were unable to work, and they received taxable grants that were worth around 80% of their monthly trading profits. And as the pandemic continued, so self-employed support unrolled in a number of phases. Around 2.9 million self-employed individuals have received grant support, and over 9 million self-employed grants have been claimed. It's important to acknowledge that those individuals and families not in employment, but being impacted by school closure and lockdown restrictions, received additional support through the benefit system. So those in receipt of universal credit and working tax credit received a temporary uplift of £20 per week to acknowledge the impact of the pandemic. And then finally, those losing jobs permanently moved on to the universal credit system. We saw a large rise in universal credit claimants between March and April. That was 1.8 million, and the activity levels there were over tenfold of the usual new claimant levels. There's no hierarchy here. All of these groups were impacted by the pandemic. Support was offered by the government to employees. It was also offered to employers. Over 1.6 million businesses received loans worth £80 billion. A number of those were offered to all sectors. There were also some sector-specific policy interventions. One perhaps unusual one that was worth flagging is the Eat Out to Help Out scheme that targeted restaurants and was in effect an incentive to encourage diners to eat out at a restaurant, and if they did so, they received a discount on their meal, and the restaurant cafe could then claim that cost through the HMRC system. There's also been support for young people to re-enter the labour market, and as I've mentioned more recently, an announcement to support older workers as well. I think what we'll hear this morning from colleagues in Germany and France and Korea is that the impacts of the pandemic have been unequal, and we'll understand some of the ways in which the pandemic has fallen in particular places. Just to pick up some headline issues for the UK, we know that under 25s have accounted for 93% of the total fall in payrolled employees. So the impact of the pandemic in the labour market has fallen significantly on younger workers. We also know that the disability employment gap has widened under the pandemic, rising nearly 1 percentage point, and there's real concern that that will widen further as we move into the post-pandemic recovery period. Black and minority ethnic workers were twice as likely as white workers to leave employment during the pandemic. So there's been a significant impact there in terms of ethnic disparity. And also the pandemic's implications have not been equal in terms of the geographical impacts. And this is something that goes beyond the sectoral mix. So there's been what some call a drag factor in some parts of the country, which can't be simply explained by the different makeup of sectors there. And as we begin to move from the pandemic, the bounce back in some areas has been much weaker than in others. So for example, in London, job levels are still 3% below the pandemic levels. In terms of women and the pandemic, women were 200,000 more women were placed on furlough than men. Women are experiencing higher levels of redundancy than they experienced during the 2008 Great Recession, although still less than men. The impact of lockdown on women has been significant in terms of women experiencing the double shift of home working, so spending more time on unpaid household work and schooling school-age children than men were likely to do when they were both working at home. It's also clear that sector has shaped outcomes, and the picture here is one that is captured both by women being overrepresented in vulnerable sectors like hospitality and non-essential sectors, but also overrepresented in relatively safe sectors like healthcare, education, and public services. In terms of the impact for women in the labour market, there is no clear picture here. A very recent report by the Resolution Foundation actually suggests that gender differences in the labour market may not be as large as expected. However, even this conclusion comes with some caveats, because as we experience a return to the office, there is concern how that might impact particularly on women in terms of promotion. And it's also the case that anxiety and depression are higher for women as a result of the pandemic as well, and the longer term impacts of those are yet to unfold. Significant impacts of the pandemic in terms of workplaces. During the pandemic, all but essential workplaces were closed, and this gave rise to home working. We see now great interest amongst employees in having some degree of home working. Only about 12% of employees said they wanted no home working whatsoever. And we're now seeing policy moves to allow employees to request flexible working from the first day that they take up a job, whereas previously they had to wait 26 weeks. There's been a shift in attitudes and our understanding to work, a greater awareness of the role of key workers and precarity, and the greater sympathy and understanding in terms of the importance of paying everyone a living wage. Nearly 2/3 of the public express support of a decent living wage being paid for both those above the age of 23 and below the age of 23, and feel that should be raised across the board. Growing interest in terms of what the pandemic means for work-life balance. The think tank Autonomy says that a 4-day week within the public sector, for example, would stave off burnout, would improve work-life balance, and create up to 500,000 jobs concentrated in disadvantaged regions. What we've seen, though, is that the response to shorter working week interest has been a number of small trials, particularly those offered by individual firms, rather than broader developments. I'll now pass over to John Hudson, who will pick up on maybe some of the bigger political and policy narratives in terms of what the pandemic might mean for social security.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. So, as Neil's outlined, very significant policy change and obviously huge system of social security that relies heavily on means testing and conditionality, and benefit levels have been at a fairly low level in terms of replacement rates. However, as Neil outlined, when it came to the emergency response to the pandemic, many of the schemes abandoned that approach. Most obviously, the furlough scheme actually replaced a significant proportion of earnings. And this raised questions in the minds of many as to whether this might point to a future approach that might be somewhat different. And certainly amongst many members of the public as well, the pandemic was the first time they may have engaged with the social security system and were perhaps surprised to learn what the reality of the system was. Now, if move on to the next slide, Neil. Yeah. One of the things that the pandemic absolutely did demonstrate in terms of government response is that it is able to do things in a different way. And first of all, we could note the speed of response, which was phenomenal. Policy frameworks were invented almost overnight. And in terms of trying to come up with a very strong response to the insecurity generated by the pandemic, the government made an obvious decision that it preferred to respond quickly rather than think about the finer detail about how it might target the responses to those that are most in need. And this is in sharp contrast to the long-term situation in terms of income support. As the pandemic unfolded, again, as Neil has already articulated, there was also a recognition inside government that it needed to be generous in terms of identifying and supporting some additional needs. Perhaps the most prominent example here was this uplift to the universal credit system of £20 a week, which is a very significant uplift to what was a fairly minimal social security benefit. There are also additional supports that were targeted at families with children. Now, again, this marks perhaps a difference in terms of approach that had existed in the past. However, what we also saw in terms of the pandemic and the impacts is that these existing inequalities, existing gaps in wealth, they also significantly mattered in terms of the impacts. So again, if we move on to the next slide, Neil. One of the things that's become a real focal point for debate over recent years, but I think brought even further to the attention of the public mind with the pandemic, is the widening wealth gap in the UK. Now, when the pandemic hit, there were fears, of course, for so many aspects of life. And one of the things that the government really feared is that the housing market would collapse. So he put in place some emergency supports for the private housing market. And actually, rather than collapsing, the housing market has experienced phenomenal growth during the pandemic. House prices have risen quite significantly, partly because of tax cuts that were put in place during the pandemic to prevent the housing market from collapsing, but also because of wider trends. Now, what we saw during the pandemic is that the wealth gap actually widened, partly because of trends that Neil's already outlined, that those that were in higher paid jobs were less likely to be furloughed, less likely to see their earnings interrupted, whereas those in lower paid, less secure jobs were much more likely to see impacts in terms of their income. But then also unanticipated aspects, I guess, of the pandemic. So actually people were spending less on everyday life, perhaps in many sectors of the economy. That then went into savings, and many people started to invest more in housing, and people started to think about changing ways in which they might use their home in terms of those home working trends. And that actually partly contributed towards rising house prices as people look to combine work and life in different ways. But of course, that had unequal impacts. And what we ultimately saw really was a widening of the wealth gap, where the richest 10% families saw their wealth increase really compared to those at the median by quite a significant amount during the pandemic. Now, if we move on again to the next slide. The UK, as with many countries really, it already had exaggerated house prices, which were creating some challenges, particularly for younger generations in terms of finding housing affordable. And I think this question of intergenerational fairness also came into sharp relief during the pandemic. And certainly what we can see in terms of early impacts is that we have to have a concern for the long-term consequences of the pandemic on the youngest generation. And we can see this in a number of areas. One is in terms of the impact on younger workers. So anyone that was graduating from university, school or college during the pandemic obviously found it very difficult in terms of finding employment. Younger workers were disproportionately affected by the pandemic in terms of job opportunities. Of course, education has been very significantly affected, be it in terms of university and college education, which did continue, but in a different form, usually online, as was the case in much of the world, but a especially strong impact on school-age children, and schooling has been very significantly disrupted during this period. And this has raised questions inside government about whether there need to be catch-up programs for school-age children to help them make up any lost learning, with a particular attention perhaps paid on those who are already perhaps at risk of falling behind average attainment levels. But this, of course, longer term may interact. As wealth inequalities have exaggerated, as older people have built up lots of wealth, as housing prices have got further out of the reach of young people, and then if young people see scarring effects in terms of their long-term earnings because of periods of unemployment or the impact of the pandemic on educational attainment. So there's a real concern here that we need to think about the long-term intergenerational fairness impacts of the pandemic. And then if we move on to next slide. Ultimately, I guess then this all points to a question of whether new political narratives might emerge following the pandemic as a consequence of all of these pressures that have started to come to the fore in terms of political and popular debate. Now, at the outset of the pandemic, there were a lot of commentators who said, well, maybe this is going to be a big moment of reflection. Maybe this is going to be equivalent to the period in the UK during the Second World War, where people said, look, we need to think very differently about society. We need to go into the future with a new spirit of fairness. And in the case of the UK, during the Second World War, that was the Beveridge Report that articulated the vision for a welfare state. And it put Britain on a very different track in terms of questions of social justice and social security. However, as the pandemic has unfolded, I think that it's hard to argue that that is going to be the case. Now, there's some phenomenal research that's been undertaken during the pandemic to try and track how attitudes have shifted. And certainly there are some signs there that some public values and some public attitudes are starting to shift. So at York, we have a COVID Realities project that's tracked in depth really, how people are feeling and experience the pandemic. But some studies are also saying that one of the things that may occur during this period is that rather than people saying, well, look, this was a very challenging period, we all need to come together and think differently about how we support each other, that many people are inclined to see the pandemic as exceptional. And even though people saw holes and gaps in the social security system at that particular moment in time, they may think, well, look, that was just a one-off. It's not like that normally. So it's really difficult to say for sure which way this is going to play out longer term. But we have seen, I think, some shifts in elite attitudes. And it's very interesting, I think, that the UK government has started to bring to the table some questions about redistribution that it perhaps wouldn't have done before the pandemic. And actually, although we've got a fairly conservative administration at the moment, they have already made commitments to significantly increase taxation in order to invest in health and social care, which perhaps they wouldn't have done without the shift in public attitudes that occurred during the pandemic. Okay, so that brings us to the final slide, just to try and sum up some of the key themes. So what might we see in terms of the implications of COVID for understanding where the UK state may go longer term? Well, one thing is we've seen the state be very agile. It did a lot in a very short period of time. That exposed some holes in our public administration frameworks, but certainly the state did act very, very quickly, develop new policy at scale and at speed. There is also now a very significant debate about, well, we've had the crisis, it's obviously still ongoing, but now people are thinking about rebuilding the future. And although it's, I think I wouldn't say it's like a post-Second World War period where there's a whole-scale reconstruction along a Beveridge report line, certainly there's a huge debate on all political sides about how do we rebuild for the future. The current government talk a lot about where we need to build back better, for example. The fragility of the social security system was absolutely demonstrated during this period. Very significant gaps in support, required emergency state responses. Right now, the question is, are some of those gaps going to be addressed, or is it back to business as usual? Today's a very pertinent moment to have this discussion, actually, because the £20 a week emergency addition to the universal credit system has been withdrawn today, but there's a very live political debate on all sides about whether that's the right thing or not. We've seen for sure questions about precarity of the labour market, some of the impact on industries that are still struggling to recover has raised questions about whether pay and conditions need to improve in certain sectors. Right now in the UK, we have shortages in a number of areas because there are insufficient workers in some areas of the economy. And the government is quite explicit now that it thinks that employers need to improve labour market conditions in order to address those shortages. But also ultimately the pre-existing disadvantages and inequalities are not only still there, they've been exaggerated in many instances by the pandemic. And issues of inequality are now very much at the forefront of political debate in the UK. And again, the current government, even though it's a relatively conservative government, is explicitly engaged in a debate about how do we level up different parts of the country, how do we address those inequalities. Now, whether they will take that agenda forward seriously, it's too soon to tell. So I think the question is not for now, we're still in the middle of this pandemic, but what's it going to look like after 2023? Will we see new political coalitions, new political debates, or will this be a case of people look at this moment and say, well, that was an exceptional moment. Let's go back to the way things were before the pandemic. Okay, so that's it from us. Thank you everyone for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the presentations.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Professor Neil Lund, as you have mentioned, York University and Kihasa have been maintaining our cooperative relations for a long time. And even this time around, thank you once again for working with us in terms of coming up with the policy results and recommendations. And there's a lot of research projects that were introduced at York University. I'm sure that if anyone is interested, you'll be able to look for some more details. Now moving over to France, Professor Christine Erhel from the Center for Employment and Labor Research in France will make a presentation. So can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can
네,
you
잘
hear me?
들립니다. 잘 들리시나요?
I'm just going to my slides. All right, so thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present that work today. So I'm going to present it, but it's a co-authored paper with Pierre Courtiou, who is here also on the screen. So we are going to focus on French social employment and economic policy facing the COVID crisis, with the general message that the short-term reaction was very strong in terms of employment maintenance in France. I will come back to this, and income support as well. And that now the debate is about new economic priorities for the future. So I will come back to that in my presentation. So just a few words about the general context of the COVID crisis. So it's important to see that in France, the COVID crisis has hit in a specific context because it was the start of a decrease in unemployment. So as you know, we have quite high unemployment in France, and it's been staying at a high level for a long time. But the start, just when the COVID crisis hits, it was the start of a decrease in unemployment. So it's important for the general context. Maybe I can just show the graph, as you can see here. In 2018, 2019, the unemployment rate was decreasing, and it's been also decreasing during the crisis, as you can see also on the right-hand side with the quarterly unemployment rates. There has been some increase during the first year in 2020, but then it started decreasing again at the beginning of 2021. So it's, I will come back to this. Of course, it's related to the policies that were implemented also in France. But as I said, a decreasing unemployment context, and also a country which is characterized in general, so from that respect, it's very different from the UK, by a rather generous social protection system, which provides a very high replacement rate for unemployed in unemployment insurance, quite high minimum income, also quite high income support for families, and in general, very well developed health services. So it's from that respect, it's very different from some other more liberal countries. However, of course, that system has been hit very strongly by the COVID crisis. Of course, this is related, as in all other countries, to economic restrictions that followed different lockdowns. So we had 3 lockdowns. First one in 2020 in spring, then another one in autumn, and another one in April 2021. We also had a very long curfew period, which was very hard for different shops and, of course, restaurants, bars, etc. We also had very long closures for all entertainment facilities, for sports facilities, for bars, restaurants, etc. So, of course, all this has had some important consequences for firms, for also jobs, etc. And the other thing that has to be taken into account in France is that there was a strong social contest climate just before the crisis. As I said, unemployment was decreasing, but we also had some strikes and some demonstrations based on two events. The first one was the movement of the so-called Gilets jaunes, yellow vests, who were protesting against prices, oil prices mainly, and the idea to introduce a tax to try to limit the use of cars and to try to get a kind of green tax. And this was the start of a social contest in France. And the second one was around pension reform, because there was a project of structural pension reform that was made up by the government just at the beginning of 2020, so just before the COVID crisis. And of course, this was then abandoned, but it means that when the COVID hits, despite that quite generous social protection system, the general context for the government was not very simple, because it was characterized by a very tense social climate. Then what were the policy reactions? So mainly, as I said, it was focused on employment maintenance through a scheme called of short-time work, donc chômage partiel in French. I will come back to this, and also income support for firms and for vulnerable groups in general. And then more recently, the government tried to switch to some new priorities and to favor public investment in some priority sectors. So I will come back to these different elements, starting by the massive use of short-time work to maintain employment. So here, the starting point was an existing scheme, because short-time work was already existing in France. It was used during the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, but on a limited basis. It was not a success at that time, and not many firms used the scheme during that financial crisis. So the government already had in mind that it was an interesting measure to develop. And so when the crisis hit, the COVID crisis hit, they had prepared in a way the idea to use that short-time scheme on a larger scale. And here the example was Germany. So maybe then the comparison with Germany is going to be interesting, because what was really said in the French political discourse was that we have to use short-time work because it was a great success in Germany in 2007, 2008. So we should also in France be able to use that device because it helps maintaining employment. So of course that's very important for workers, but also it helps a firm keeping their labor force and then starting more rapidly again when the recovery starts. So that was the idea, is that it combines social outcomes, but also it's also good for economic competitivity. So in practice, what was done in France to make that type of program more attractive was to open it to on a large scale to different publics. So not only people working on permanent contracts, but also people working on short-term contracts, on part-time contracts, in public firms or in care services. All these people were not eligible before to short-time work. And it was also extended for people who could not work because they had to take care of their children, for instance, because of school closures. So it goes beyond the traditional scope of short-time work. It's not only related to firms' difficulties facing demand shortage, for instance, but it was more extensive and also includes some more social goals. So I will come back to this with some statistics. Then the second thing was to make it more generous because it's for workers, they receive 84% of their net wage. It's the minimum. The firm can pay more if they want, but it's the minimum. And for that level of wage, the cost is zero for employers, up to more than 4 times the minimum wage level. So that's really a very generous scheme in terms of short-time work. So it's in theory, actually, it's a very well adapted framework to deal with this particular situation of decreasing demand for some firms and administrative constraints for others, especially bars, restaurants, entertainment, leisure, etc. And it should help them keeping their labor force and mitigating the consequences for workers. As I said, this is largely based on the success of Germany in 2007, 2008. So in France, during the COVID crisis, that program of short-time work was really a huge success. So in the sense that it started being used very quickly during the first lockdown, which started in March 2020. And as you can see, in blue, you have the number of employees in partial activity in short-time work in millions. And it's increasing very quickly in March, April, and then it starts to go down in May because it's the end of the first lockdown. But the use was massive. It's up to 8 million employees who were covered in April 2020. And then it goes down, but it remains quite high because even in April, it's still, in April 2021, it was still 3 million. So during the third lockdown, which was not as restrictive as the first one. And it concerns all types of firms in terms of size, so even small firms, But also, of course, it's concentrated in some specific industries like accommodation, catering, trade, services to firms. Then, as I said, the reasons for using the short-time work scheme are diverse because if you look at this table, it represents the share of firms which are not using, it's the first column, partial activity, and then you have the different reasons for using it. And so you can see that demand shortage was quite important at the start during the first lockdown, but then it goes down in proportion. Then you have a quite high number also of firms declaring that they use it because of compulsory closure following the restrictions. But as you can see, there was also a use, which is it's that column, the column about workers caring for children and vulnerable people to COVID, which was introduced a bit later by the government, and is in 2021, it was also an important reason for using short-time work. So as I said at the beginning, it's a program which is usually focused on demand shortage problems for firms, but here it was extended to other reasons. Okay, then that was the first device, very important. And in terms of expenditure, it's 27 billion euros in 2020, and in projection it's about 13 billion euros in 2021. So it's quite high expenditure on this, of course. Then the other part of French policies was focusing on income support for firms and also for households. So it's quite similar to the measures that were presented for the UK. For firms, the idea was to provide some specific loans which were guaranteed by the state to avoid bankruptcies and to face cash needs and cash difficulties for firms. Then there was also for smaller companies a solidarity fund to provide also some financial help to those firms. And then smaller measures like the possibility to pay tax later, etc. So it's again, it's quite high amounts with 35 billion euros for the solidarity fund and up to 140 billion euros for the loans granted by the state. Looking at households now, as I said, it's very important to know that first, the French system is in its normal functioning very protective for workers and households. So there was no real need to introduce new programs at the start. Unemployment insurance provides quite good coverage for workers. So the only thing that was done in that respect was to postpone a reform that was supposed to happen in 2020 and which was supposed to be more restrictive. So they just postponed it, and now it's going to be implemented in autumn 2021. There were also some specific measures for cultural workers, but that's the only group for which there were specific measures. Then for self-employed, the government had to introduce specific measures because they are not, they are badly covered by unemployment insurance. They have some access, but it's limited and it's a limited amount. So there was a complement, a specific allowance during the lockdowns. For the minimum income, again, it's quite generous, but during the lockdowns, some additional allowances were introduced for the poorest households. Then the public on which French social policies are focused the most is youth, because youth are not well covered by all these programs because they do not have access to minimum income. So they depend very much on their families, and it's not always an evidence for them to be well covered also in terms of income by their families. So there was some new developments of programs focusing on disadvantaged youth to provide them some assistance in terms of income and also in terms of labor market integration. And also for students, because many students were left alone during the lockdowns, especially those who do not live by their parents and who were alone in some cities with great difficulties to get, even for some of them, even food, etc. So there was some specific programs targeting students. And more generally, there was also this idea, as you mentioned, for the UK, that there were some intergenerational inequalities, and that crisis was particularly hard for young people because they were studying, because this was so perturbating their studies, because this was also preventing them from entering the labor market in good conditions. So for the government, young people were really a priority in terms of public policy. Okay, so last part is about the perspectives that the government has tried to announce since September 2020. So the idea was in September 2020, the French government thought that the crisis was over and that it was going to be the recovery period. So they decided a recovery plan, focusing on ecological transition, for which they have put so 100 billion euros over a 2-year period, with some priorities around green transition, some new energies, and also decarbonation, railways, hydrogen, etc. The idea was also in that plan to try to relocate some industries in France, because the crisis has shown the importance of being independent from other parts of the world in terms of production. So that was also a part of that recovery plan. And finally, as I said, also focus on youth through the development of apprenticeship. So here again, it's the German model that French politicians have in mind, with the development of apprenticeship, and also some cuts of social contributions for firms who were hiring young people. So all this was, as I said, it was implemented progressively. But of course, the difficulty is that the crisis was actually not over, and that all these priorities have to be taken into account in a context that was still very difficult throughout the end of 2020 and the year 2021. So this year in August, there was a new investment plan that was added. So again, on some innovations about biotechs, about health, about semiconductors, hydrogen, etc. So the idea is to go further than the first recovery plan by putting more financial means on these priorities. So basically, the idea is that the French government is trying, and has been trying quite quickly, because it started in 2020, to switch from a short-term employment maintenance and support for firms, etc., to a longer-term perspective through these recovery plans. But as I said, the switch is not so easy, because the crisis has continued actually throughout the year. So there have been some criticisms against these recovery plans, because for different reasons, because they were very much supply side oriented, and some economists were asking for more demand side measures, support for income, etc. Because also it's largely based on tax cuts or on social contribution cuts. And there have been many of these type of policies in France over the last 10 years. And the existing evaluations show that there are important limitations. They do not really help firms developing their competitivity at the international level. So maybe it's not the best solution to proceed. And this is also related. There are some important criticisms against innovation policies in France, research and development policies, because the government is always saying that it's a priority, but then in terms of public expenditure, the level of, for instance, R&D expenditures in France is not increasing. So there have been a lot of criticisms, and it will go on because we will enter the presidential campaign now. So I think that might be, of course, an important issue also for the future. Okay, so I switch to the conclusion. At this stage, the first thing is that French policy has been quite successful in terms of short-term outcomes during the COVID crisis, because the unemployment rise has been limited, as I showed, and now we are back on a decreasing slope. The level of growth in the recovery period is quite high, and so we are, for instance, actually at the moment in a quite good period in terms of economic growth. The rise in poverty has been limited. It really concerns very specific groups. There has been no social contest during the crisis, except against vaccination during the last months. But I think it's getting better in terms of outcomes anyway. The fraud has been relatively limited on the firm side, on the use of these different short-time work measures, for instance. So generally, it's considered by different institutions in France as a success, the management of the crisis. But then, of course, there are difficult issues ahead. The first one is the end of specific support for firms, for companies, because it's going to stop progressively. So all the types of programs, short-time work, it's already ended. So the specific program, so the program itself will remain, but on its normal basis. And the other thing, and Solidarity Fund also is going to close in December. It's now very restricted to specific activities which are still under constraints. But so that's the question is, will there be an impact or not of closing these programs? And then the other thing is, of course, that we remain with some structural issues that were there before the crisis and that have not disappeared. So the problem of youth unemployment, some inequalities also among workers, among occupations that are quite important in France, with some low-wage activities who have, in general, continued working during the crisis. You mentioned them also for Britain. So the essential workers who are generally low paid. Skill shortages also are quite important. There are some tensions on the labor market when the activity starts again. And of course, as I said, the question of innovation, which is of course very important for the future. So both private and also public expenditures for innovation. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor, and we'll ask questions during the Q&A session. And moving on, would like to invite Professor Christina Hissel from Goethe University, Frankfurt. Do you hear us?
안녕하십니까? 잘 들으시죠? Yeah. Hi, I just see I got a message. I should shorten my presentation to 15 minutes. Yes, I will try my best. I might skip a few slides. Yes, I'm trying to share my screen. Is it working? Yes, I think that's working. Perfect. Yes, so Well, first of all, yes, I'm delighted to be a part of this conference. I was really intrigued by the presentations we have had so far, and I think my presentation from various angles is going to fit very neatly into what we have already heard from the colleagues from the UK and France. Yes, and I'm basically a lawyer, so what I'm most interested in is usually not like the short-term measures, I mean, those also, and the impact of the crisis as such, but very much the long-term consequences that the current crisis might have on our social laws. That's basically what my presentation is going to focus on. Very briefly, what I'm going to talk about basically is the effects of the crisis, just very briefly, the reforms that were triggered by the crisis and how they've worked out, and then cast a spotlight on just a few areas where the crisis has probably shown us weaknesses or critical points of the social security system, or yes, social law issues in general, where the crisis is probably really going to influence very much the long-term development and at least the long-term discussion at the moment. So let me start by just, yes, very briefly pointing out the toll that the crisis has really taken on Germany. So we can see here there were more than 4 million infections in 4 waves. There have been almost 100,000 deaths only in Germany. But what you can also see, I think, from this comparison that I put on the slide here is that vaccines are working, because in the second large wave, we have really had the largest death toll, and it was a devastating period for Germany. The third wave was nearly as large in terms of infections, but at that time the vaccine rollout has simply already shown its effects, and there you can see the death toll is simply not comparable to what it was during the second wave. So that's certainly something we can see for Germany. Yes, the consequences were, like in most other countries, of course, repeated nationwide lockdowns. I'm showing you here the shelves. You have seen perhaps similar pictures from other countries. March 2020, stores running out of toilet papers because people were hoarding them at home. Yes, economic consequences. There has been an unprecedented drop in GDP in Germany. So it was almost 10% in the second quarter of 2020, and on average for 2020, the drop in GDP was about 5%. So that was something that Germany has never ever experienced. As you can see here, also employment and monthly incomes have suffered to a certain degree, but you can also see the degree is much lower basically than it is for the economic impacts. And after the presentation of Christine, you can already imagine why that might be the case. So there have, of course, been measures in place to avoid the economic crisis from becoming a social crisis to the same extent. Yes, let me perhaps move on right away. I think the main issue that is being talked about very much now is really the impact that it has had on inequality and poverty. Because in general, I think there is a feeling that Germany has emerged from the crisis very successfully. So labor market data, we're going to come to that, is really showing like the German story as one of the success stories. But we really have a serious issue of the crisis exacerbating inequalities. So moves that we have already seen before have been exacerbated, and it has definitely hit the poorest, yes, the hardest. So that, of course, has to do, yes, with all kinds of areas where, of course, the poor are living in smaller houses, so lockdowns for them mean something different. Homeschooling is much more difficult for them. Very often they work in occupations where, yes, which were much more affected than those of the people who were just like working at home with their laptops, did not suffer any income decrease at all. So in the end, what the data are really showing us is that the majority of the population suffered no income loss at all, but there were a few groups that were really hard hit. and that includes marginal workers. We might come back to that a bit later. So marginal part-time workers and the sole self-employed. So that's really the hardest hit group. Temporary agency workers, workers in certain sectors, of course, hospitality being very affected, and single parents notably. Yes, and just to contextualize that a little perhaps, in Germany, we have had a rise in poverty already prior to the crisis. So here you can see the green line, which you can see here is the unemployment rate. So Germany has had a very, very favorable labor market development, being one of the countries which really emerged from the global financial crisis very fast, and unemployment rates really, being on the increase, on the decrease all the time. Also, employment rates being increasing. At the same time, we have seen a rise in inequality and a rise in poverty also. So that is 2019. That's before the crisis has hit, and then of course inequality further increased after that. Yes, just to give you a bit the general picture. So Germany is basically the country with the second highest employment rate in the EU. So that's kind of also one with one of the lowest unemployment rates in the EU. So labor market data really been relatively favorable for Germany all that time. At the same time, Germany is, as you can see here, is the sixth. It's the country with the sixth largest low wage sector in the whole EU. And the countries that have a larger low wage sector are all Central Eastern European countries, so much poorer countries generally than Germany. So you have a labor market that is very effective, that brings lots and lots of people into employment, but where you have also large inequalities and wage differences. Yes, and now let's come to, like, very briefly, just the social law reforms that immediately addressed the crisis and are still addressing the crisis. So first of all, of course, all kinds of measures to mitigate the risk of infections, and that includes workplace health safety measures, yes, remote working, short-time work, of course, and the modernization of collective bargaining structures. So in all these issues, you really have seen a very fast rollout, a very effective cooperation of the government and social partners, so tripartite dialogue really showing that it works. So back in March, all the important legislation was basically passed in March 2020 within a matter of days and weeks. So that certainly is seen as a large success. Also very fast was the introduction of measures to ensure the availability of essential services or to compensate for the interruptions. That's notably working time exceptions for essential services, where you say, well, nurses or also certain administrative staff, they are just allowed to exceed working time limits by far for a very short time. On the other hand, of course, also leave for child and family care for those who were affected by the closure of care facilities, schools, and so on. And thirdly, and importantly, measures to alleviate the economic consequences. So also here the rollout has been really fast and smooth and really characterized by that cooperation of the stakeholders. So you had, for example, an insolvency moratorium. You had, the increase in unemployment and short-term work compensation. We're going to come to that. Also simplified access to means-tested benefits. That's also something I want to come back to. And also an extension of certain areas of the social insurance system. So basically, industrial accident insurance in the past was limited when you were working from home. So that was really extended and is now rather comprehensive when people are working from home, so that there's really good coverage. And also family benefits were extended to situations, notably of the closure of schools and institutional care facilities. Yes, and now I will just pick out a few of the long-term discussions that have emerged from the crisis. I'm aware that I think I have already used up 10 minutes, so there's not too much time left, but let me just address a few. And one of that is really the development of addressing precarious working conditions in certain sectors, because what the crisis has really shown us is just how dismal the working conditions were in specific sectors, and that is notably the case for seasonal work in agriculture and in the meat industry, where you usually have, of course, workers imported, so to say, so workers posted from Central and Eastern European states, and their living and working conditions have simply very much facilitated infections. So those were the main hotspots of infections at the workplace in Germany. And that has really, I think, given rise to a large debate about, what can be done against that, because there has been an awareness very long of working conditions probably not being good in those sectors, but in the end, doing something against it has usually been very difficult, although opposition parties would have called for that for a very long time. And then in 2020, you have seen a reform step that I think would have been absolutely impossible before the crisis, where the lawmaker basically outlawed certain types of contracts in the meat industry. So both the use of self-employed contractors and the use of temporary agency workers is simply prohibited as from now for the core activities in the meat industry, so slaughterhouse activities, where you just say, well, certain types of contracts are just so susceptible to abuse that in the end it's better to outlaw them, because controlling it has proven to be too difficult, and the crisis has really shown us how far this has gone, and this simply has to stop. So I think that is something that you could not have imagined without the crisis. Of course, there is now a constitutional lawsuit pending, because the companies are trying to defend against that. But yes, certainly a very interesting development here. Yes, I have to say a few words about short-term work, although Christine has already referred to that. Yes, so in Germany, basically you had a long-term tradition and you had a long-term structure for short-term work in place. And just as in France, it was basically just expanded during the crisis. The criteria for using it were amended, and it was made more accessible for more firms. So basically, if only 10% of the staff of a certain firm are affected, you can already apply for short-term work compensation. The most important pillar for short-term work in Germany is always the ownership of the social partners. So short-term work is only introduced if there's an agreement between the management and the works council, because the idea is it should only be introduced if both sides really agree that in the long term we will go back to full-time work for those workers. So it should not be used in cases where, yes, the employment relationship does not have a future. So that in the end, those companies, let me cut that short. Let me just say it was really used on an absolutely unprecedented scale, 5 times higher than during the global financial crisis. And let me perhaps show you a bit of European data in order to really visualize the difference that short-term working can make. Because in the EU, basically, during the first crisis, most countries, and I think what Christine said before is really applicable to many countries. In many other countries, there was no scheme for short-time working during the global financial crisis at all. Many tried to introduce it, but it was basically late, and it was usually not well designed. It was not efficient. So let me show you what the outcomes were. And here you have, so first of all, this is the GDP, the EU's GDP, how it developed during the 2 crises. So this is the global financial crisis. Basically, the impact on the EU's GDP was not that large. Compared to that, the impact of the COVID crisis was much, much, much larger. And here you have the impact on unemployment. So here is the global financial crisis. Unemployment was rising exponentially, and the development was very prolonged. So actually it was only after 5 years, if you look at the whole of the EU, that yes, the rate started to drop. And there was just a few exceptions in Europe, and that was basically Germany and the other countries that had a very developed system of short-term working. And now this is the COVID-19 crisis, which had those massive impacts on GDP. Nevertheless, the rise in unemployment has been much, much smaller, and basically the numbers have gone down very, very fast after that already. Of course, we're going to see the long-term development, but there is an idea that it's not going to have this development. And the reason is, or one of the main reasons for that, is that short-term work systems were very much mainstreamed throughout the EU by the European Commission. And there's also this scheme, the SURE, which is really focusing on redistributing, actually generating money by the European Central Bank and redistributing it to countries that have to use short-time work, so that it is really, so that all the countries are also able to finance it, because it's extremely expensive in the short term, but in the long term, it has just proven to be extremely efficient. Yes, how much time do I have left? Almost nothing, I guess. So I'll skip apprenticeship training. Yes, remote working, basically during the crisis, it has been mandated actually. During certain periods, it has been used, of course, a lot more than that. What it has really led to in the long term is a debate on a right to work from home, which has been pushed very much by parts of the previous government. You might be aware that Germany just held elections, and we're not sure what kind of combinations we're going to have in the future. But there's a huge debate now on whether there should be a right actually for employees to work from home. So that's one of the large debates we're having. Another one concerns means-tested benefits, because I showed you before, Germany is a country of relatively significant inequalities and also rising poverty levels. Yes, Germany has a means-tested benefit system which really stands out. So here in European comparison, you can see if you're unemployed, you're very, very likely to be poor. So this is relative income poverty levels. So in Germany, much more than in any other European countries, 70% of the unemployed are poor. So on the one hand, you have a labor market that is very inclusive. Most people have a job, but if you are unemployed, very fast, you're going to descend into the means-tested benefit system, because the unemployment insurance benefits are short. They are not basically, not everybody is entitled to them. So you're basically very fast, descending into the means-tested benefit system. So that's also something where during the crisis, the conditions have been alleviated. And we're now facing a discussion on what to do with that in the long term. And that really includes all kinds of new ideas, even the introduction of a universal income system. So a universal basic income system. So that's certainly going to be a very interesting discussion. I'm going to skip the pension system, I guess, in order to just come to one point, which I also find extremely interesting. And that is the debate that we're now having about social security coverage. Because you might know Germany as country of Bismarck, which invented social insurance back in the 19th century. Yes, the interesting thing is that Germany, nevertheless, up until today, has a very limited system, a very limited coverage actually of social insurance. So while other European countries have really extended the system, notably to the self-employed, Germany has never done that. So up until now, the self-employed are not really covered by social insurance. So notably also not by old age benefits and not by unemployment insurance, which means they're not covered by short-term work benefits. So they were really the one group that was hardest hit by the crisis. Yes, and I think that really also triggered the discussion, which we have already had before. Like, there was an awareness before, but nothing really happened. But here the crisis really sped up, I think, the discussions, because they were uncomparably more affected by the crisis. So here you can see more than half of the self-employed have been affected compared to just 15% of employees. And for women, it was even, the numbers are even much higher. So 63% of women were affected, and half of those affected had liquidity reserves for only 3 months left. So there is really a kind of social crisis of the self-employed, which makes you think of how can we cover them in the long term by social insurance. And the other group where the discussion is really, has really been increased. I think that the level of discussions has really expanded very much during the crisis, is marginal part-time workers, the so-called mini jobs. That's also kind of special German model where people are simply excluded from social security, also from taxes, because the idea is if you have a small scale part-time job, it should be easy to do that. And in the end, we've had a lot of research in the past on how this is just abused by employers. The benefits are not going to the workers, they are basically just going to the employers. Yes, and people are just not covered by social security, although in practice they may work much longer working hours than they are working officially. So it may not be that really, really small part-time job. It may in fact be a really, really vital source of income, and those workers are really vulnerable. So also their exclusion from social security is very much debated at the moment. Yes, and with that, I'm finishing. I thank you for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to the debate. Thanks a lot.
Thank you once again, Professor Christina Hiesel. It was a comprehensive presentation. And now moving on to Kihasa's Senior Research Fellow, Dr. Kim Tae-wan. Hello, I am Kim Tae-wan from Kihasa. It's an honor to be able to have and participate in this forum along with renowned professors. I'd like to ask for you to understand that I have to wear my mask because of the COVID quarantine guidelines. I only have about 15 minutes, so I will just briefly run through the key important points. So in 2019, after the start of the pandemic, a lot of the countries are suffering from the COVID virus. And the global situation, as you can see, stands at this. Over 4 million, 4.6 million have died as a result of the virus. Germany is going through its fourth wave, and a lot of other countries are trying to look up various different policies in order to address the response. And with the vaccines, in Korea, we have a 53% administration rate for completion of the virus. And at the end of October, the government is also thinking of raising this figure to around 80%. I truly hope that it will contribute to the government's efforts in recovery. Now, if you look at the second part of the table, this is the impact of the COVID-19 changes in index of income compared to the pre-COVID levels. You can see that we haven't really recovered, and this is probably one of the key challenges that we face. If you compare the 1998-2008 financial crises, those really affected people who are in the vulnerable sectors. But for the COVID-19, I believe that it has impacted the society as a whole, and there's less limitation of the social safety net. So the young, the youth, the elderly, as well as temporary workers are really affected, and they bear the brunt of the COVID-19 crisis. Even with our employment rate, the employment rate has fallen significantly, and with the vaccine, we are seeing an uptick, and we're rebounding back after June levels, but still, it's still quite unstable. We looked into these figures with the Ministry of Welfare from 2019 to 2020. In terms of income, about 27% of the population said that they had seen their income levels decrease, and 14% are actually saying that they have seen their expenditures decrease. In terms of the livelihoods, pre-COVID and then after COVID, changes in the living standards over the past 5 years say that 13.8% said it was very bad in 2018. But if you can see, the dark bar graph has really risen to 32.1% after COVID. I believe that this will be very similar to the UK, Germany, and France as well. There's various different needs and concerns intergenerationally. I believe that it's a recurring issue in the Korean market as well. It doesn't really mean that just as we overcome COVID-19, we'll be able to address all of the challenges that we face. Because of the fundamental issues and some of the social safety net issues, because we did not have a strong social safety net and care for the elderly, these are some vulnerable areas, and I believe compared to the youth, elderly poverty is a huge issue. There is also a discrepancy in the level of income and wealth. I believe that this is one of the graphs that the government should take into account. Elderly poverty is a major issue in Korea. From 2005 to 2018, if you look at over 40% of the elderly are distributed in the median income of 50% and below. And the elderly 65-year-old and over living on basic living support has been increasing from 35.3% of the recipients in 2019, and it goes up afterwards. I believe that this is a big issue that the Korean government really must take to heed. Now let's look at the policy issues and policy responses. The red bar is the vulnerable, socially vulnerable groups that are not receiving income security systems. And about 26% are actually in the lower income bracket. However, they're still not receiving income security systems. Another aspect that we can see, in Korea, we do have the pension systems for the elderly. However, they are in the gray area and the blind spots, and there's no policies in order to support the youth. So that's why the government has been putting in a lot of effort in order to address these issues. In Korea, we lack the employment insurance system. There's a lot of people who are not able to receive support from the employment insurance system. You can see that the percentage is quite large. So this is another key aspect of the COVID-19 repercussions. Compared to other countries in the OECD, the social expenditure of Korea is quite low. A lot of the researchers are mentioning and raising their voices that we need to raise the level of social expenditure. And the government is responding back, saying that with the low birth rate in Korea, we'll have an aged society, and as a result, that will increase with the elderly provisions and support. So in Korea, the main issue of discourse is how to expand the social safety net and how to expand the social expenditures. This is a major overview of the social safety net. And if you look at the median number and, of course, the red boxes, these are some of the public that are placed in the blind spots, and they're not being able to get support. Even the elderly who have become unemployed are not being supported by the government. When the COVID-19 truly hit in 2020, there were some key measures from the Korean government. We had the emergency economic policy meeting after the COVID-19 outbreak. I believe that this is related to the livelihoods of the people, and a lot of financial institutions contributed to supporting a lot of self-employed and the small businesses in order to raise their credit levels and to have them maintain their jobs. They introduced the employment stabilization package to support small businesses, and of course, special policies for employment stabilization, and of course, supporting the safety of the public livelihood. The government executed 4 times of supplementary budgets over the course of 2020 and 2021 for the industries as well as self-employed. If I were to pick 2 key issues, it's the Emergency Disaster Relief Fund paid to all of the public between May to August last year. And this was supporting the small businesses in their sales revenue as well as the vulnerable sectors. And recently, in July of 2021, it's not nationwide, just like last year, but 88% of households were provided with pandemic relief subsidy for the public. And in the major milestones, you'll also see some policies catered to small businesses, supporting the weak and vulnerable. And if you compare last July and this July, we also had the Korean New Deal policy that was implemented and enacted. In line with expanding the employment system, and we also have the various different safety nets, this also looks into the fiscal investment and institutional improvement. And based on this, it was looking into the Digital New Deal, Green New Deal, and carbon neutrality. These were some of the 10 key projects. It's compensating for what we lack in right now and, of course, preparing for the future. I think that the French society had something quite similar to this one. It's also supporting small and medium-sized businesses, but also it's lacking in providing for the future. Of course, this also has to tie in with the overall budget of the government, so we still need to keep an eye on this. After COVID-19, we had the universal employment insurance system that was implemented, and it will be expanded in phases. So for platform workers and wage workers, as well as special employed workers. And in order to create an exact system, they had the non-standard form of employment for this July, and it had the first round of platform workers, and this will be provided in January of 22. The reforms are being conducted along to the schedule. However, it's a question as whether it's being implemented in the right way and if it is being helpful to the people. And a lot of the New Deal incorporates some of the facts in order to provide for the blind spots in the income safety net. I believe that we will be able to have a pilot test and pilot project in order to compensate for the weak income safety net. There were a lot of security policies to strengthen the income security for the poor. From last year to this year, they have abolished this kind of limitation so that all of the vulnerable groups are able to receive support, financial support from the government. And in Korea, we are strengthening the employment support service. And if the people are still employed after the support programs, they will still be able to receive the support from the government, not just about the cash, but also in terms of the services to provide aid and support for training, as well as reemployment. This is probably one of the key aspects for income security for the poor. But other than that, there's also a response for the future, looking at economic and environment factors. Along with the Industry 4.0, there have also been policies in order to support the vulnerable sectors. There's a Digital New Deal and the Green New Deal looking into various different infrastructures and digitization of the economy. There's another carbon-free country declaration that was made in December of 2020. I'm sure that these are areas that other countries are looking into as well, so I believe that it's also a ground for cooperation. Lastly, I'll look into the social sector to reinforce the social safety net. And I mentioned the boxes in red, so it's also an issue of raising the support for the vulnerable societies and looking into the pension system for the elderly. The government is, in fact, planning to expand these services to reinforce the social safety net. Next year, with the presidential elections, I'm sure that all the parties are avidly discussing these issues. We truly need to think about the cash benefits and cash support, but we also need to look into the care services for the handicapped as well as the elderly. In the long term, the government will not only look into providing cash support, but also the service support. However, the key is, will we be able to implement all of these plans according to the schedule and according to our intent? So I was quite limited on time. That's why I had to run through the presentation. But I believe that we'll be able to address some issues through the panel discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. We have now gone through the 4 different presentations of the countries. And we're able to look at the overall policies. And of course, it could be too vague and too wide-reaching. However, we will take a little bit of a deeper look into the policies after the panel discussion. And if you go into the Kihasa website, you'll also be able to download in English and Korean the details of the policies as well as the results. So if you are interested, please go onto the website and download the brochures. We will resume after 8 minutes. Thank you very much.
네, 안녕하세요. 두 번째
Good
세션
evening.
주제별 개별 토론과 종합
It is now
토론을
time to
진행하도록
start
하겠습니다.
the
저는
general
두 번째
discussion and
세션의 진행을
comprehensive
맡은
discussion in a row.
한국보건사회연구원의 강신욱이라고
My name is
합니다.
Kang Si-nook from
여러분
Kihasa.
반갑습니다.
Nice to meet you all.
저희가 앞에 세션에서 네 분의
During the previous
훌륭한
session,
발표를
we've
들었습니다.
gone through
한번
4
발표에
eminent
대해서
presentations, and I'd like to thank
저희가 이
all the
발표를
speakers
통해서
for their
영국,
insights.
프랑스, 독일 그리고 한국에서
England, France, Germany, and Korea shared their current status related to COVID-19 and policy responses. And even under the current crisis, they also shared how each country has been holding up different policies and responses. And based on those presentation contents, we'd like to begin our discussions in the presence of 4 discussants. Let me introduce them first. First discussant is Professor Jung Jae-hoon from Seoul Women's University, and second discussant is Professor Son Dong-gi of Honam University. And the third speaker is not present in person, but he is joining us online from Helsinki, Dr. Shin Young-gyu of University of Helsinki. And the last discussant is research fellow Dr. Kim Hyun-kyung from Kihasa, who has been leading us through this forum as MC. And each discussant is given 10 minutes, and you are invited to make discussion on a specific speaker, or you can deliver some messages on overall agenda, or you can also ask question to a particular speaker. So would like to start by Professor Jung Jae-hoon.
안녕하세요.
Good evening.
Good morning in Europe.
And good morning
We began
to our
with,
colleagues in Europe.
Great Britain, but my discussion focuses on the case of Germany because I have studied in Germany. I find the presentation of Professor Hisse shows the situation in Germany very clearly and exactly. The COVID-19 crisis has affected more than anything the social disadvantaged groups. In this point, we can assume the polarized trend between pandemic winner, pandemic gewinner, and pandemic loser. Professor Hisse shows, above all, various situations of the COVID losers. For example, the self-employed belong to the most excluded group from social security coverage. While they experience massive losses in their income, they get only limited state help, just like a drop on a hot stein, ein Tropfen auf heißen Stein. Besides the self-employed, millions of marginal workers, mini-jobbers, belong to the typical COVID loser, as Professor Hisse shows. A few days ago, I saw a report of GDF, a kind of public broadcaster in Germany, about the situation of apprenticeship training, das duale system. Professor Hisse shows also there are less made contract for job training compared to the time of financial crisis in 2008. In the last year, 2020, in Germany, 11% fewer new training contracts are signed than in the previous year, as little as never since the German reunification. Hospitality, Gastgewerbe, and event industries are particularly affected. In other words, the industry that are particularly restricted by the corona measures and policy. On the other hand, there are a pandemic winner because the need for leisure, Freizeitbedarf, is continuing to have a boom. In this context, I have some questions. First, generally speaking, I have a question to Professor Hiesel. First, generally speaking, who are the typical pandemic winner according to your opinion? How big is the gap between the winner and loser? Second, how about the differences between men and women who experience the time of COVID-19 crisis? Third, is there any regional differences, above all, between the West and East region, zwischen Ost und West? Are West German people once again winner in this pandemic time? Finally, respond the German welfare state, there's a Sozialstaat, solidaric to the problem of polarized society, if there is such a problem. Furthermore, how can a German social system develop a sense of solidarity in this time? Thank you very much.
네, 정재훈 교수님 감사합니다. 제가 두 번째 토론자께 마이크를 넘기기 전에 제가 소개를 해드리는 것을 깜빡 잊어버렸는데요. 저 끝에 저희 보사연의 김태환 박사님이 발표자이시긴 하지만 이제 종합 토론과 토론에 참여 질문에 답하시기 위해서 이 자리에 함께 계시고 있습니다. 제가 소개를 드리는 거를
Session.
죄송합니다.
I just forgot
두
to
번째 토론자로
introduce him.
손동기
Apology.
교수님께 부탁드리겠습니다.
Next, Professor 손동기.
안녕하세요. 두 번째 토론을
Hello, I
맡은
am
호남대학교의
the
손동기라고
second
합니다.
discussant,
저는 중점적으로
Sondonggi of
프랑스
Honam
사례에
University.
대해서
So I would
토론을
like to talk about the
우선
French
발표를
case.
해주신
First of
크리스틴
all,
교수님한테 감사를 드립니다.
Professor Christine Erhel, thank you
프랑스가
very much for the
코로나로 인해서
presentation.
굉장히 큰 경제적
So
위기를
France
겪었다고 합니다.
has really
작년
been hit hard
-8.8%
since the COVID-19 crisis. The GDP in 2020 was negative 8.3%, which was very difficult, and it was the biggest plunge since World War II. In this crisis, as shown in the previous announcement, it can be seen that the government made good use of these short-term work to make the labor market safer. And it also used various different policies to allow employers to apply for partial employment to avoid dismissal and remain useful. However, we need to look into the key aspects. If we think about France, we have to think about the rigidness of the labor market. It's very difficult to gain employment and find jobs. This has actually been discussed since the 1980s. So in order to create employment, they cut down on the labor costs, and that's why they had looked for various temporary workers. Before 1980, it was around 5%, but recently it has surpassed 16% with the temporary and non-regular workers. Considering this, the employment or the quality of employment is deteriorating. This is a concern that I have. And after the President Emmanuel Macron gained power, a lot of the labor unions like CGT and CFDT have all been very concerned about the flexibility of the labor market. And I believe that the French labor community is concerned about the growing labor market instability. And in fact, in France, the labor market, we have to think about whether the expansion of the labor market is important or whether it's the stability. In 2005, the CPE arose, and a lot of the university students in France took to the streets. it wasn't really about the expansion of the labor market, but it was also about the quality and the stability of the labor market. And that's why this policy was even abolished. Afterwards, if you look at the changes in the labor market, like the El Khomoli law, there's a lot of increases in the labor market policies in order to promote flexibility in the labor market. A lot of the companies, as well as the government, is looking towards the labor flexibility issues, and there's a lot of concerns towards this. After the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the boundaries between employers and employees are becoming very vague, and it's very vague in terms of the actual hours of work and hours that you are not working. And so the discussion related to this is still quite lacking. It's not just about France, but also in Korea. I think that we still need to discuss these issues. Thankfully, France is looking into the social safety net and expenditures in protecting the market, and it has been able to safeguard this to a certain extent. However, the sustainability of this is in question. So we really need to look at whether maintaining labor is important or the stability and the quality is important. I think that we really need to think about this issue. One of the biggest issues are youth unemployment and early retirement. In 2010, after the revolution of the pension law, the overall livelihoods are deteriorating, as well as the employment rate as well. And nevertheless, the youth unemployment still stands at a very high rate. So I believe that these are some key issues. In the long term, what kind of measures is the French government looking into? This is some questions that I had. So I want to ask Professor Christine Herel. I think that France's intergeneration employment policy is the most important. And to this end, I want to ask whether the quality of labor is important or expansion of the labor market is important. And with this, I close my discussion.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
세 번째 토론자는 헬싱키 대학의 신영규 박사님이십니다.
And the third discussant is Dr. Shin Young-gyu from University of Helsinki. Do you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you well. Okay, thank you for having me here today. And I'm Young-gyu Shin, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki in Finland. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation for 3 European countries and one Asian country, South Korea. And I prepared some questions regarding each country addressed today. For the first time, I have a question about the British case, and then Professor John Hudson and Lund mentions the possibility that the Britain would be able to rebuilding their existing social security system. So when I heard about it, and then I was wondering, what goal do you think the Britain will pursue for the future, though, if they want to restructure their social security system? For example, improving inequality in the society, or the more encouragement of welfare to work, for so-called workfare, and so on. And I was wondering this point. And when it comes to French case, and it is very interesting that the French government have used the short-term time work support scheme. But Professor Christine Herel said, and then it will be the support for the short-time work scheme will finish it soon. But I was wondering if what will happen after its scheme finished, because as far as I know, the growth of part-time in France is also has been increasing as the other European countries does, like Germany and the Netherlands as well. So I wondered how well the social security and social protection schemes for part-time workers has been established in France. And so let's move on to the German case. And yes, I think the German case clearly shows that the impact of the pandemic, increased the disparities in the working condition and income security between those in the precarious work and the regular workers who has a very stable employment situation. I think that, yes, I think the German case also prove this is the case at the current situation. So regarding the point is that I think that because of the current situation, it is very important to the relationship between the labor market system and social security system to improve the precarious workers job security and working condition, and also income stability. So I was wondering what are the situation, the employment relations in Germany concerning the issue about the restructuring of social security system, and particularly during the pandemic period. As far as I know, the work councils in Germany has played a very important role in adjusting the relationship between employees and employers. So I wondered what's the attitude toward work council or trade unions have towards the restructuring of the German existing social security system and also the labor market relationship. Okay, let's move on to the Korean cases. And I think Korea is very interesting. Yeah, because interestingly, the pandemic situation make the Korean shows how Korean social security system is weak, particularly responding to the crisis, the urgent crisis, because I was surprised to hear that the South Korean government decided to give money unconditionally to every person in South Korea for 2 times. Yes, for the first situation, for the first one, targeting at all people, and for the second one, the 88% of the people. So it is very interesting, and there's even in Finland and other Nordic European countries, it didn't happen. The Nordic countries just used their existing social security system to protect the people in crisis or the vulnerable employment status. I think the situation shows that Korea has a Korean social security system has very significant weakness to protect the universally the ordinary people in a urgent situation like the pandemic. So I know well the government has been very active in improving the social security system in South Korea, but I was wondering what goal the government has been considered in improving and establishing well the social security system in South Korea. I cannot find what goal the government pursue at the moment, and then so. Usually, the Korean social security system, just the many people and decision makers and social social scientists and professors and researchers are dealing with the issue about the social security system in South Korea, just focused on increasing the benefits and the leveling up the generosity of the social security system, social benefits in South Korea. But I think it is a pity that they do not tend to consider the labor market issues or the labor relations between, even though South Korea has suffered from very serious problem concerning the precarious workers and super large disparities between the precarious workers and regular workers. So I think the South Korea, many people need to consider the both aspect of workers at the same time when they establish the social security system or improve the social security system in the future. Yes, that's all I prepared for this discuss. Okay, thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. And lastly, I would like to introduce Dr. Hyun-Kyung Kim. I am Kim Hyun-kyung from Kihasa. So there were a lot of questions, so I will just add a few comments. And just like Dr. Shin has mentioned, I want to think about what direction Korea is going, and we have to evaluate the current response. And while I was attending this conference and while I was preparing for it, I thought about the right title for it. I believe that Korea is still one of those countries that have a lot to improve in terms of the social safety net. So our presenter also mentioned the universal employment protection law, insurance. And that kind of insurance is actually compensating any worker so that they will be able to be covered. And of course, for the Korean sickness benefit system as well. Within the OECD, Korea was the only country that did not have this kind of system. We have been discussing these two issues for a very long time, but still it was quite slow in developing. And last year with COVID-19, the government had talked widely about the necessity of these two systems, and it evolved in a very rapid pace. And that's why I really thought that we could turn the COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity. And if you look at the universal payment for financial support, is it truly correct in providing universal coverage and universal payment? And we're still contemplating which direction is the right way. We're still looking at the evaluations about the size and the scope of these payments. I want to ask Mr. Kim Tae-hwan on what he thinks personally and what kind of discussions there are in Korea. And I was looking at the policies in the UK, and the support for employment maintenance was enacted or introduced after COVID-19. What kind of support was it in detail? I looked at it on the website, and it also has the PAYE system, and it's also looking into a real-time measurement about all of the workers, like whether they're part-time workers or non-regular workers. And this kind of pay system, I think, brings us to believe that Korea is also going into the right direction. Whether we'll truly be able to look at the vulnerable workers, like the full-time, part-time, those with an agency, and whether the workers are truly being protected. So this is a question that I had for the UK. And for France, as you mentioned the short-term work, and you also mentioned that it was expanded to the short-term temporary workers. In fact, it doesn't really go into implementation just by talking about it. So I was wondering how the policy itself had changed and whether it worked. And what do you think the secret behind it was? And France also had the short-term work, and you mentioned that it will come to an end because it's a bit limited. Last year, you also sent in a report for the long-term, short-term work. So long-term partial activity policy was newly enacted in Korea. So what was this kind of policy for the mid to long term? Are they thinking about implementing something like Germany in the mid to long term? And what was the ultimate goal for this? And for Germany, I'm also curious about the overall labor market along with Dr. Shin, and I will also piggyback on his question. Thank you very much.
자, 그러면 지금부터는 종합 토론으로 넘어가겠습니다. 지정 토론자들께서 각 발표자들께 질문을 한 게 있습니다. 예컨대 정재훈 교수님은 독일의 히스 교수님께 질문을 드렸고요. 그리고 손동기 교수님은 에르헬 교수님께 질문을 드렸습니다. 그리고 남은 두 분의 토론자들은 네 분의 발표자 모두에게 질문을 드린 바 있어서 제가 요청드리기는 발표하셨던 순서대로 한 5분 정도씩 답을 포함해서 논의를 해주시면은 감사하겠습니다. 그러면 먼저 룬 교수님께 마이크를 넘겨야 되겠는데 룬 교수님 잘 들리시나요?
Professor Lin, I would like to give 5 minutes to each speaker in the order of presentation, 5 minutes to make a comment. So Professor Lin, would you please address the question? Can you hear us?
Yep, thank you. Okay, I'll maybe say a little bit about the furlough scheme and then pass over to John if you want to talk about the goals of social security reform and benefit politics. In terms of support for employees, as Kihasa, a colleague, has flagged up, that was provided to employees through the pay-as-you-earn tax system. The pay-as-you-earn tax system is when employees are taxed by their employer at source. So that tax goes from their pay packet through that system at source. And the furlough system covered employees for up to 80% of their earnings, later reduced to 60%, and there were also opportunities for people to work some part-time hours and to have the rest made up through the furlough scheme. What's really interesting about the pay-as-you-earn system is it covers employees, and as we've heard across a number of the countries, a real challenge was to deliver support to self-employed workers, and self-employed workers do not have their tax administered through the pay-as-you-earn system. And this raised a number of challenges. First, how to deliver support to self-employed workers, but also something about the fairness within the tax system of how we did that. So employees and self-employed workers experience differential rates of taxation. you could say that it's more advantageous to be a self-employed worker in terms of the tax that's taken from your earnings. But both of those groups required state support during the pandemic. And it became very apparent, and the Chancellor, when he made support available to self-employed populations, said, you know, you need this support now, but it does raise questions, and we do need to look at ensuring that the tax system is fair, both for those that are employees and for those that are self-employed. So the pandemic has raised a number of questions about the structure and the way in which we engage with the labour market, and also how a number of other further social benefits cover or don't cover particular types of worker. So, for example, the challenge in terms of receiving sick pay under the pandemic was another challenge for those employees who had perhaps different types of employment contracts in terms of casual or gig economy type employment contracts. Maybe I'll pass to John to say a little bit about the goals of social security reform and perhaps where the debate has been over the past 12 months and where potentially it's going, and we can pick that up as well later.
Yeah, so the question was, you know, where will Britain perhaps go with its future if it wants to restructure its social security system? Hard to know, of course, because we enter that area of the rhetoric of politicians and then the reality of what they might do. But there are some changes in rhetoric which I think are very important and interesting. So today, actually, the UK Prime Minister is giving his speech to the annual conference for his political party. He's already been interviewed a lot this morning on television and radio, giving us a clue as to his messages. And he's talked in a way that I think his party perhaps haven't talked for a long time about addressing significant structural problems in the labour market. And he said it's time that the UK ends its long-term model of having an economy with many workers in low pay, relatively low productive areas of the economy. However, it doesn't seem that the future is going to be, I think, about moving away from welfare to work and conditionality. I don't see any evidence that they're going to abandon those aspects of the system. And it doesn't seem likely either that this is going to be about increasing the generosity of social security benefits. So as we mentioned in the presentation, there was a temporary uplift to the main social security benefit, now universal credit, during the pandemic, and that ends today. What that means in practical terms is that for a million of the poorest households, they're going to immediately lose about 10% of their income. It's a huge cut. And according to one of the think tanks, the Resolution Foundation, this will take basic benefits to the lowest level that we've seen since 1990, which was the last year Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. So it feels like we've been on a path of rolling back some of that spending on cash benefits. So where that's pointing to, and this is a trend that we've seen from our current administration for a while, is the issue we flagged earlier, which is to place more pressures on employers to improve pay and working conditions. And there's some stuff that has happened there that is real. So our minimum wage has increased quite significantly, out of step with many other countries actually. And so different political parties have done this. But also all of this in the UK has to be placed in the context of exit from the European Union, which has fundamentally reshaped the labour market. And right now we have significant shortages in many parts of the labour market, and many employers are saying, can we revisit laws around immigration? But the government is saying no, and their stance is that this is a chance to reset the labour market and increase wages. Now, the hard thing is how much of this is politics and trapposition against political opponents, how much is real. That's hard to say, but it's certainly the case that this phrase levelling up now is very central to our centre-right government, which is normally territory from centre-left. They've changed the name of one government department, so it now has levelling up as part of the agenda. And I think that British politics, UK politics has been reset a little bit by that exit from the European Union debate, because it flagged that many areas of the country felt left behind by economic growth. So there does seem to be a serious commitment to looking into that, but at present the details are very, very, very light. I think maybe final thing to say is that right at the start of our presentation, Neil flagged the complexity that we need to be clear that the UK has significant devolution to constituent nations. And if we were to talk about Scotland, it would be very different from if we talk about the UK government, even the names of the relevant departments. So the UK government does not have a Department of Social Security, it's called Work and Pensions, which gives you a clue. Whereas in Scotland now, they've introduced social security into the terminology of the government departments, and the phrase in the language is very different. So that will also be part of the debate as this unfolds post-pandemic. Hard to say where it's going to go, but the rhetoric has definitely shifted, which I think is interesting and important.
네, 두 분 답변과 논의 감사합니다.
Thank you for your answer. And next, I'd like to ask Professor Christine Herel.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the comments about the French case. So maybe for the first questions that were asked, yes, I agree with you. There has been a strong increase in labor market flexibility in France over the last even 30 years. I think there's a continuous trend towards more flexibility in the French labor market. And this goes through the increase in temporary work and more generally in all forms of atypical jobs, whatever they might be. There has been also the introduction of new types of labor contracts for some definite duration, etc. The other elements participating to that is that there has been a decentralization of collective bargaining. So this was in the labor law and labor ordinances of 2016 and 17. So the firm level, the company level, has gained importance in the definition of labor regulations. And finally, another thing is that the role of the minimum wage on the labor market has also decreased in France because there has been no, as we say, coup de pouce in French, so no increase, no discretionary increase of the minimum wage by the government over the last 12 years. It's just been increased by the level of inflation. So it's the mechanic increase of minimum wage, which is guaranteed, but no more than that. So in the end, the general picture is that, yes, there is a trend towards more flexibility. There is a trend, as you said, in a way of decreasing quality of jobs in France. That's true, especially for lower qualified jobs. This is not the case for the higher qualification jobs, but for the lower qualified, yes. So what was the aim of this policy of deregulation of the labor market? Of course, it was to increase the volume of employment. And this was not so much a success because, as I said, the decrease in unemployment has started, but far later than what was expected. So it's difficult to really assess the impact of this flexibility of the labor market reforms, but their impact is still uncertain on the labor market. Then the idea from the French government point of view, if you look at Macron discourse, for instance, the general idea is to favor flexicurity, so to have that flexibility side, but also to introduce more security. which is supposed to be done through, especially through the increase in training efforts for workers, and also some more security provided by health insurance, etc. But basically, the most important thing would be, I think, the increase in further training for workers in France. But of course, again, the evaluation of all that, the impact of the reforms of the continuous training system is still to be done because it's very recent. It's been decided just before the COVID crisis, so it's difficult to say what is the actual impact. So at the moment, I would say that there is no real equilibrium between flexibility and security, and that the flexibility side has been the most important one. And the security side is still to be weighted because outside the COVID crisis, of course, because it's not been implemented so much before the crisis. So then what are the perspectives now? So the perspectives for the future months are quite uncertain because, as I said, there were 2 more reforms that were postponed by the government because of the crisis. One is a reform of unemployment insurance, which is quite hard for unemployed because it reduces the allowance that they get, especially for short-term, for people who are on short-term temporary jobs. So this is something that is going to have an impact. And so it's being implemented just at the moment. It started in October 2021. So let's see what will be the impact on workers and also on the return to employment. The idea is, of course, that it's done because it should favor the return to employment, but this is, of course, uncertain also. And the other one is the pension reform, because it's been abandoned, but it is still somewhere in the ideas and projects of the governments, and so we don't know if it's going to come back before the presidential elections. So, but anyway, it's going to be a topic for the next presidential campaign. So we are in that moment, so quite a lot of uncertainty in terms of perspectives. Then for the other questions, I think that looking at short-time work and the program that was implemented during the crisis, it's not going to stop. What is going to stop is the exceptional conditions that were made during the COVID crisis. So it's going to, it goes on, but the normal conditions of the program. It means that it's less generous. It's not 84% of net wage, but it's about 70. The duration, for firms, the coverage of the costs is also lower. But the program is not ended as such. It's going to be maintained. And there is also that long-term short-time work scheme that is also a possibility. So it is based on collective bargaining at the company level. So it's not something that is generalized in the sense that you need to have first collective bargaining within the firm to be able to implement the scheme. And then you can get more favorable conditions, but you have to be certain that you will guarantee a certain volume of hours worked for the workers. Okay, so that you commit to a certain volume of hours worked about 1 or 2 years to be able to implement that scheme, and it's based on collective bargaining. So it's not going to be over, but just to come back to a more normal condition. And then there was also another question about the frontiers between work and leisure in general, so the changes to work during the COVID crisis. So yes, that's also a big topic in France, because just before the crisis, there was in the law something to try and guarantee the fact that people can disconnect from work. It's called the right to disconnection. Okay, so it's again, companies are supposed to implement conditions to make workers be able to disconnect from work. So there are some agreements at the company level about this, and this should be extended. And then, of course, there is the issue of teleworking, because it's been developing during the crisis, and most workers want to go on with a certain amount of teleworking. And there is also a lack of collective agreements on that, so it should be developing in the next months and years. So that's an open question also for the future. Okay, so maybe I'll stop here because I think the 5 minutes should be over. Thank you very much again.
네, 크리스틴 에르 교수님 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for your comment, Professor Ergel.
답변을 해주실 분은
And the third speaker is Professor Hissler. Please.
좋은 토론을 감사합니다, 교수님. I will use this opportunity that first of all, Tong 교수님 has given me to use a few of the slides that I had to skip before. So perhaps let me show you this one slide again, because you asked about the apprenticeship system. And yes, I think for those who don't know the system, is it working? No. Yeah, for those who don't know Germany that well, in order to understand the German apprenticeship system, I guess you will have to forget almost everything you know about education in Korea, because it's the diametric opposite of that. Forget about young people learning from books, everybody wanting to go to university. The German success model in terms of vocational training is really one where young people can basically leave school at aged 15, and continue to learn in a company. So on the one hand, your training is mostly company-based. So it's like 4 out of 5 days per week, usually you are in the company, trained in the company, and only 1 day per week you will be at a vocational school where you're learning some background knowledge. Yes, and that's still the majority of young people are still in this kind of apprenticeship training system, although they're now usually older. Many of them complete a bit more of school-based education before that. But that's really the kind of system that has worked for Germany very well, which is the reason why we have the lowest youth unemployment rates basically in Germany. Have had the lowest youth unemployment rates in the whole of Europe for many years. Yes, I mean the system relies on companies having to provide training according to a tight system. They have to pay the apprentices a wage according to collective bargaining usually. Yes, we also have some control, and it's of course based on social partners' consensus about what should be taught and what rights there should be. So there's also a very tight legal system actually about the rights of apprentices, because they're of course young people, they are vulnerable. Yes, there needs to be a lot of monitoring. So that's a kind of system that has very often been pointed out as best practice, and something that is really, yes, also fueling the labor market boom that Germany has seen, because it just teaches young people relevant skills, and it teaches them exactly those skills that are needed right now in the labor market. Because companies, and that's a very important part of it, companies will only offer apprenticeship training opportunities in those areas where they really need them. Because for a company, usually it's a net investment. So for 3 years or so, you're training an apprentice. That is usually a net investment, because the labor outputs, the labor productivity of the apprentice is usually much lower than what you have to pay in terms of wages to the apprentice and the wages to the trainer, who will lose a lot of working time by dealing with the apprentice. So in the end, companies will only use it if they have the feeling, I will use that person in the long term. I will take that apprentice over as a skilled worker afterwards. And the advantage of the apprentice is that they really have a recognized qualification. There's an examination after the usually 3 years, and they can also change to another company, and it's transparent. All the companies know for this occupation, the training considers this and that. So that is much more than on-the-job training, as you would perhaps have it in the UK more. It's a recognized profession. So that's the model, just in order to explain that a little. And what the crisis has done, what economic crisis is usually due to such a system which relies so heavily on companies is that, of course, in the situation of crisis where employers are very wary to hire people in general, they will, of course, also be very cautious about taking in new apprentices. And that is what you see on this slide. Basically, that is the international financial crisis. You've had a drop, and you've again had a drop during the COVID-19 pandemic. But what you can also see on the slide is that, this is a phase of labor market boom. This is where basically employment has risen a lot, but apprenticeship training contracts have not risen. So this is not a problem that is mainly focused on short-term crisis. It's more long-term development, that we have demographic change. There's less and less young people available, so to say, in Germany. And many more are striving for higher school-based education. And it's really difficult for firms because there is this economic boom. There's a huge, huge demand for apprentices. Most companies are finding it really, really difficult to find apprentices in general. So it's not something that is really reduced to the crisis. And I think what the crisis has taught us in this regard is that perhaps we need a bit more of government support for the system. So the system basically relies on putting the burden on the company because you want them to offer training only when they really need the people. You don't want to give financial subsidies to them, basically. But during the crisis, you really see that on the one hand, you have companies who really need skilled labor, and they are really looking for skilled labor, but nevertheless, they are hesitant to take in apprentices because they just face a difficult situation. They are not willing to make that net investment. And I'm also doing a lot of comparative work here. So in Austria, for example, which has the same system, subsidies have been introduced a few years ago, and it has not seen this kind of drop during the crisis. And generally, the drop is not as large as in Germany. So that's certainly an area for discussion. No, this is how I stopped screen sharing. Yes, Professor Zhong has had several more questions, I think. Yes, the gap between winners and losers, who are the winners of the crisis? I think winners, I would say the average person, the average family. So in terms of mitigating the impacts of the crisis, I think the average person has really benefited very much from the very effective rollout, the fast rollout of measures. Where Germany really is having problems is to really reach those at the margin who were most affected, because in the end, all of those systems are designed to be effective. I mean, even the short-term work system, which is hailed so much all over the world, it is designed to be effective and to not be kind of a charity system. So those who have low wages already, for them, having 60, then 70, then 80% of the net wage is, of course, very, very low. And there's no minimum amounts. In other systems, the system is more social, I would say. In Germany, it's always more, trying to avoid dead weight effects and so on. So it's always very much, it has this idea of not, the system not being used by companies who should go bankrupt or by workers who should be laid off, because in the long term, there's no future for the employment relationship. So in that way, you have a system that is very efficient, but that is leaving out, I think, it's just not caring so much about those at the margin. And that's, I think, the kind of direction that Germany in the end has to go or should go, and which the crisis has notably pointed out. Yes, I think I'm already talking very long. Very, very briefly, Xinju's name has mentioned works councils. That's also, of course, one of the areas where the German system is relatively special, because company internal representation of workers is very developed. So like if a company has 5 employees, the employees have a right to establish a works council, and the works council's right to co-determination is just yeah, they are very extensive in international comparison. There is, at least in the larger companies, you really have an ongoing dialogue between management and labor, and that has proven invaluable during the crisis. So the rollout of health and safety measures, also schemes for working at home, yes, and also leave schemes for those who were affected by school closures and so on. None of that could have been imagined really without that very effective system of dialogue on several levels. So you have the tripartite dialogue with the government, the sectoral dialogue, and then the company internal dialogue, which was just very important. Yes, so to conclude, in the long term, I think, yeah, Germany will really have to focus on the margins, on equality, on poverty developments, which are really concerning, and on including more and more people. And I think here what I have pointed out in terms of social insurance coverage would be an absolutely important first step. So include the self-employed, include, like, abolish the mini job system. It's just not working. And yes, work perhaps specifically on the Mindestsitzung benefits. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Christina Hiesel. And lastly, Mr. Tae-hwan Kim. Hello. Mr. Shin and Dr. Kim also asked about my personal views. I believe that there are some policy reforms that the government is seeking. I think that the key is to relieve the blind spots and, of course, to address the bipolarization. Also looking into the universal employment insurance, as well as the issues related to the elderly, and to have a pension reform, and the relation between national pension and basic pension. I think that the government really needs to put a lot of thought into it, and I believe that it is putting a lot of thought into it. As for cash support, I think that there's limitations in providing cash support to address all of the different imbalances. So I think the next government or the next administration will look at the care services, how to combine cash support as well as care support in order to reduce the gap between the haves and the have-nots. We are also working with the Ministry of Welfare, but regarding employment, I think in the Ministry of Labor, there's a lot of issues that need to be dealt with that the social insurance is not able to address. And Dr. Kim also mentioned a lot of the areas where we're lacking in terms of labor and employment. I think that we need to separate those issues. For employment, we need to provide more jobs and support with unemployment payments and compensation. But in terms of labor, I think that we need to look into the industrial aspect of it with the benefit systems and compensation systems. So that is an area where the Labor Research Institute is looking into. So I believe that they're contemplating, but we don't see actual results just yet. There's a lot of discussions being held before the presidential elections. Maybe in January and February of next year, the government parties will be able to come up with different policy measures in order to bridge the gap. Thank you very much for that comment. We have completed the presentations as well as the 4 discussions. As we all know very well, the COVID-19 pandemic is unprecedented. No one has actually experienced it before, and we need to look into what benefits the social safety net has. But regardless of what kind of benefits it provides, it's a big threat to any country, to any person. So how effectively each country is responding should be shared. And we have a lot of curiosities regarding each other country's situations. I think that because of that, we kind of used up all of our time. For Europe, I think that it's around your lunchtime. But thank you once again to the presenters and your discussions. Thank you once again. It's a little bit late, but I hope that you enjoy your lunch today. And of course, all the presenters and discussants who are here on site with us in Korea, thank you for your passion to share your knowledge. With this, we will close the Turning the COVID-19 Crisis into an Opportunity, the 24th Global Social Security Forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you.